Hello, and welcome to Productivity in Prose, a podcast about making the most of your writing time and honing your craft. Whether you're a seasoned author or a new writer, this podcast offers helpful tips to maximize your writing time, increase your writing productivity, and tackle the sometimes tough aspects of the writer life. Hi, I'm your host Emily, author of Suspended in the Stars, among other things, and today's topic is getting past fear and imposter syndrome. Welcome back to the podcast. Today's topic is really one that rests heavily on my heart as a creative. If you didn't know, rather than creative writing, I actually studied music in college and graduated with a degree in vocal performance. I play flute, saxophone, and guitar, and I love to sing. I even had a stint where I played cover songs and songs I'd written at local coffee shops when I lived in northern LA. I genuinely thought I might make it in music until I realized how much of a performer you have to be and how much that was not me. It was around that time I took up photography, and I went on to be a professional wedding and portrait photographer. I still take headshots at writing conferences and occasionally do portraits and headshots locally. And if that wasn't enough already, I'm also a graphic designer and mainly focus on designing book covers these days when I'm not writing. Why do I share that? Because I work or have worked in various areas of creative arts for most of my adult life, and I know that creatives are prone to a few things. One being imposter syndrome, but another being fear in a lot of forms. I want to dig into those today and what I think drives and fuels them, but I also want to look at ways in which we as creatives can shelter ourselves from some of the things that induce these feelings. To start off with, I want to address fear. Though I would posit that fear and imposter syndrome can coexist in a nice and terrifying little party of their own. This first part is somewhat directed towards newer writers because I think you are most at risk to fail because you gave in to fears, more than those of us who may be a little further along in our writing journey. But don't skip ahead just yet. The reality is, no matter how successful you are or how many books you've published, you can still be susceptible to these fears. I see fear in these 5 ways, though some may mix together at points. Number 1, fear of not being good enough. Perhaps the most prevalent and widespread fear most writers, published or not, have is not being good enough. They're worried their book won't be entertaining enough, polished enough, humorous enough, or add in your category here, enough. The struggle here is, what does good enough truly mean? Good enough to hit the New York Times bestseller list? Good enough to land an agent? Good enough for your friends to read? What I think this fear comes down to is comparison. We stack ourselves up against someone else and think, I'll never be that. And then we let that topple us instead of seeing that person or book as a goal, not a limit. There is a validity to saying a book is not good enough. However, that shouldn't be a stopping point. Instead, it should be a catalyst to shore up the areas in your work that are lacking or to start another book. For this fear, I advise talking with friends who will encourage you and honestly point out your strengths, but also for you to not compare your book to others, but instead make it the best book you can. And yes, that may take many, many revisions. Number 2, fear of critique. This is a big one, and I've actually struggled with this for a long time. It's so hard to let your work out of your hands to get honest feedback about it. I know it's made my writing better, but so often I felt most fearful right before I hit send. This could be when you're sending your work to someone like a critique partner or beta readers, or even as far as sending it to your agent or editor. No matter the stage you're in, this fear moves past simply not being good enough into the worry of what someone will want you to change. I've heard a lot of new writers ask the question of how to know whether or not to take someone's critique of their work or not. While I don't think there's a hard right and wrong answer here, as I've mentioned before on the podcast, you need to know who you're asking critique of. For this fear, I suggest knowing and trusting who you're asking advice or critique from. Don't just take the first person who says they've written a book and accept their advice every time. Test who you're asking to look over your work, and I don't really mean that literally, but I do mean in the sense that you know their credentials or what or who recommends them to be an authority over your work. And something else that's really important here: know when to push back. No, don't hear me say you should always push back, but there will likely be times when you do, in fact, need to take a step back from the critique and ask yourself whether or not what's suggested works for your book. I would guess that the times this is true are a lot less than newer writers would think, so take that into consideration. Number 3, fear of risk. What do we fear in risk? Failure. And yes, I realize things are getting a bit circular here, but I see this differently from fear of failure, which we'll talk about in a minute. Because fear of risk means you're too afraid to even get to the stage where you could fail. I get it. Putting your work out there in any capacity is terrifying because you're putting a piece of your heart out for others to give opinions on. Ultimately, we want readers to enjoy and be entertained or enlightened or inspired, whatever your goal, by our books. But the simple fact is they will never even get that chance if we don't take risks. These risks look like submitting to agents or editors, sending out works to critique partners, asking readers to give us honest opinions, or perhaps entering contests. It looks like deciding to share what we're writing, or talk about our books on social media, or even decide to independently publish our books. For this fear, you must dig deep to find the type of inner strength needed to step out and take those risks. There are no easy answers, no simple things to do, or even words to say. It's honestly something I think must come from the heart of every writer. If you struggle with fear of risk, I would suggest asking yourself how far you're willing to go to get your book published, or to publish it yourself. The answer to that question may lead you to the simple fact that a risk is involved to get to that point. Use that as your motivation to keep going in the face of any rejection. A quick note here. Don't hear me saying that you just go out there and take a bunch of risks with an untested manuscript or a book you just know someone should publish. Yes, it's good to have confidence in your work, but it should be tempered by humility. It's one thing to believe in your book and another to shove it down someone's proverbial throat. Instead, when mustering the confidence and courage to take risks, do so in a calculated way. Make sure the things we talked about in episode 6 are in line. Your book is at least self-edited, it's been looked over and vetted by critique partners, and you've done your research, among other things. Number 4, fear of failing. Ultimately, I think these fears can be wrapped up in the fear of failure. And yes, fear of failure and I are longtime friends. I'm also a perfectionist, so that means I'm afraid of failing, but more than that, I push myself to try to do everything perfectly so that I won't fail. And you know what? I've still failed, but maybe not in the way I would have thought. Story time. I need to do an episode just about Suspended in the Stars and my story of how I took it to Kickstarter. But what some may not know is that I first pitched it out to general market publishers, like a lot of them, and it was rejected. So yes, Suspended in the Stars is a failed book. But is it? This comes down to my theory of success, which I'll touch on later in this episode. But really at the core, we can see failure as debilitating. We'll let it bully us into thinking we're not good enough, that we don't want anyone else's eyes on our work, and we'll even let it stop us from taking risks because we're afraid we'll fail. But what is failure? For an author, it would be rejection, right? So we're afraid of our book, our art, being rejected. But let's frame this in reality. It doesn't mean that you are rejected. It's just your book or idea in its current state that doesn't work for ABC publisher or XYZ editor. Yes, I know that's devastating, especially if you get notes on why it wasn't good enough. But what if we were to take those no's and turn them into something more? Turn them into motivation. No-tivation? There are countless stories of big-name authors who didn't let rejection take them out of the writing game, and thank goodness for that. We wouldn't have many of the best-selling books we've come to love if one rejection, or even 20, had taken out some of our favorite authors. For this fear, though I know it will still hurt, I encourage you to push through. Take any input you can, whether from a rejection or perhaps a critique partner who has suggestions, and use that to make your book better. Or write another book. Have you exhausted every agent? Written and received a no from every editor? Write another book. I know, it's a ton of work and not something to jump into lightly, but those who are published have one thing in common. They push through rejection. Number 5, fear of success. This last one is kind of out of the blue, but I do think some people are afraid of success. This often doesn't stop someone from succeeding, but it can hang them up. Though perhaps in some cases, it does stop them from hitting the submit button for a time. The fear of actually getting that contract and all that comes after it can be immobilizing. You start to realize, my book will be read by real people. Or maybe it's the fact that you'll have to write another book and another. For this fear, I'd start off by encouraging you by saying if your book is a success, or even just you see success with it, like it's accepted by a publisher, then you're already halfway or more there. It means you are a writer and you can do what you need to. And really, this last one leads pretty perfectly into the all-terrifying imposter syndrome. According to Wikipedia, imposter syndrome is a psychological occurrence in which people doubt their skills, talents, or accomplishments and have a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as frauds. Man, just reading that gets me like, ugh! I think imposter syndrome tends to come most frequently after we see success of any kind. But whether we get a short story published or someone compliments us on social media, or we've published a book, or even before we publish a book, you're probably likely to experience imposter syndrome at one time or another. And here's why. Huge, big name, New York Times bestselling authors also get imposter syndrome. I've been listening to a new to me podcast called The Writer Files, which I'll link in the show notes. And I've got to say, most of the writers have mentioned this as something they either still experience as best-selling authors or they have struggled with it during their long careers. I know, not empirical evidence by any means, but I do listen to a lot of podcasts and I've heard a lot of authors speak. And each time I notice a common theme in the fact that they are shocked they are where they are. I have rarely, if ever, heard an author speak and say they deserved the awards or accolades or bestsellers lists they landed. And it's not false humility. They see their writing as a journey. It took friends, writing groups, critique partners, beta readers, editors, and the backing of their publishers, and then they usually mention their fans. We have to see that we're not one-person shows, despite the solitary nature of a writer's life. I think the fact that nearly all creatives feel this way should also mean something to us as writers at any level. It hints at the fact that what is universal to all of us is the sensitivity of art. Even the most hard-skinned, objective author still wants people to read and enjoy their books. It's usually why they've written them. So how do you overcome imposter syndrome if everybody gets it? I'm going to narrow in on 4 things here. First of all, I think you need to define success for you. The need to succeed, which is in each of us if we're pursuing publishing, is the thing that often drives us, but it can also be the thing that handicaps us. I found that when my definition of success is being the best or getting that book contract with that publisher, I can't see any other success. Instead, reframing what success looks like at an individual level can help us temper not only our expectations, but also define true wins for us, even if they don't look the same as wins for someone else. Next, use social media right. I could talk about this endlessly, but I'll leave it to this. Comparison truly is the thief of all joy. It's easy to feel like a fraud, even if you're published, if you compare yourself to others ahead of you in the publishing field. Or really if you compare yourself to any other writer. You're never going to match up to the image someone puts up of themselves on social media, no matter how real they're being. Celebrate your success. I cannot point to this enough. While it won't alleviate imposter syndrome, it can help to keep it at bay. Why? Because celebrating your success is admitting that you have succeeded in some way. Celebrating even what some may call little wins is a great idea because it can keep you grounded to where you are in your publishing journey, but it can also act as a milestone to look back on when you're tempted to feel like a fraud. And finally, stay humble. Friends, no matter where you're at, New York Times bestseller or new writer, see yourself accurately. This is hard, so I don't expect you to just say, "Oh, okay, sounds good, I'll do that." But it takes work to know where you're at in relation to other writers. Why this matters is a simple fact that yes, your skills may be up there on all the lists, but there is always someone equally as good running this publishing race alongside you. Or maybe you're new to all of this writing stuff and you see that there are others right there with you in the learning trenches. Humility boils down to seeing yourself accurately and holding your definition of success with an open hand. So remember to fight the fears that are likely to assail you in this writer's life, but also keep to these 4 things: an accurate for you definition of success, using social media in the right way, celebrating your successes, and staying humble. If you found this episode helpful and want even more tips on how to beat fear and imposter syndrome, like how to stop doubts from getting the upper hand, how to alleviate the fear of being exposed as a fraud, and more elaboration on these last points, you're invited to join my Patreon page in support of the show, where I'll be posting a part 2 to this episode. Tune in next week for the answer to a listener question about ways to balance a busy schedule and writing time. Thanks so much for listening, and don't forget to dream big and write boldly. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and review. If you're looking for more writing inspiration, community, craft tips, and behind-the-scenes content, consider joining the EAH Coalition on Patreon with various levels of free and paid support. You can also connect with me on Instagram at CreateExploreRead and find out more about me, my books, and my design business on my website, eahcreative.com. Productivity in Prose is an EAH Creative production.